So I think we've been discussing what's around patients and users today and how we can ensure that that voice is heard in the system. I think in this piece of work I was keen to place that in the wider context of where the public more generally is on the NHS. And I think that's one of the things that we need to think very carefully, which is how are we asking people to provide their views? Are we asking people as users? Are we asking them as taxpayers? Are we asking them as members of a local community, as friends and family, as people who know people who work in the NHS? And so hopefully some of the data I'm going to show is where is the NHS more generally. I was looking back recently at a report that the King's Fund did from 1971. And what is very interesting is how some of the debates we're having now are exactly the same that we were having in 1971. And one of the things that the report finishes with is that the standard of healthcare in this country is determined by public opinion and the ballot box. So I think with that in mind, we will look at where the public more generally is. So the first thing I'm going to show you is, I'm going to use various different pieces of polling data for those interested in the sample. By sample, I mean the people we went to. This is what we call a representative sample of the British public. And in this case, we went to 1,000 people. And this has been tracked since 1997. What do you see as the most important issue facing Britain today? And now this is a line for the NHS. And you look back in 1997. Now, what's interesting is where are we coming to again now? So look at the right of this slide. Where we were here in April 2002 is just before Gordon Brown put £40 billion back into the NHS. So what we can see, which is not the only effect, but is one of the effects of putting £40 billion back into the NHS in terms of where public opinion goes. And you can also see where we are starting to come back to in terms of where public opinion is now on the right-hand side. So around the election, we were measuring one of the highest levels of concern we've seen since around 2002. Now, this chart gets more complicated. I apologise in advance, but just to bring a few other things into play. This is the economy during the recession. Even during the recession, there was less concern with the economy than we reached for the NHS at this time. So I think from a political perspective, it's starting to look slightly worrying. There's a slide that I'm not showing you today, which shows that pessimism for the future is at the highest level recorded. Now, why is this of relevance to us? Because we need to understand we're not just talking to people as patients and users, we're talking to them in the wider context of what is the NHS and what the media and other parties and the politics is around this. And it's so important for us to understand that with the work that we're doing in our local areas. This is about satisfaction with the NHS. Again, this is a piece of work. This is the British Social Attitude Survey, which has been tracking satisfaction since 1983. And the last time this was asked in 2016, it was around 63%, which is the third highest level ever recorded for satisfaction with the NHS. And again, think back historically to 1997, 34% in those days. It's very easy, I think, in times where we're concerned with what's happening in the NHS, to forget that actually there's been times like this in the past. And again, it's thinking about what that means for us. The next slide I'm showing you is about support for the concept. This one asks, which of the following statements best reflects your thinking about the NHS? The NHS is crucial to British society and we must do everything to maintain it. Is the top line you can see there. The line below is the NHS was a great project, but we probably can't maintain it in its current form. Now, think back to the two slides you've just seen and the huge shifts we've seen in public opinion. The one shift we don't see is in a dropping of support for the concept of the NHS. So a quick straw poll of the audience. Who thinks this view, the green line, is more likely to be held by older people? Who thinks it's more likely to be held by younger people? Yeah, it's younger people. The challenge with this and with the next slide, which is we were interested in, please tell me the extent to which you think the principles should still apply to the NHS services today. So coming up to the 70th birthday, these were the founding principles upon which it was set up. And we were interested, 70 years on, the extent to which they're still supported. I think it's very easy to look at this slide and think, yep, I could have predicted that. We had an American professor in the King's Fund recently who said this is fairly unlikely to happen in the American healthcare system. And this is extraordinary, that there's still that level of support for these founding principles. Again, for the comprehensive service, that's more likely that younger people will hold that view. Again, we may speculate that's around who the NHS is for in a post-Brexit world. But again, it's about strong belief in the service. Now, there's two ways of looking at this. One is that this is great. This is a public that's hugely engaged with the NHS. The other way of looking at this is it makes change very difficult. It makes potentially necessary change extremely difficult because of our huge emotional attachment to the NHS. For you, which object represents the NHS? And someone said, it's an old teacup that's battered and chipped and stained, but I'd never use anything else. And the question for us, I think, working in this area, particularly around the NHS, is actually, does this stop us making necessary change happen? Does it stop us asking enough of the service as users of it? Are we sufficiently demanding as users of this service? Or actually, do we forgive it? Do we forgive it a level of care because it is the NHS? So a recent study by Cambridge University on patient experience surveys shows that we would give very high levels of support or give very high experience levels for care, which measured any other way is not great. So they showed people videos of GP consultations, and people would score them as very good. And then afterwards they would say, they'd show them the video back, and they'd say, did you think it was fine that the GP didn't look at you once for 10 minutes during the consultation because they were on their computer? No. Did you think it was fine, and this is a real example, that the GP was wearing their football kit and was clearly in a rush to play five-a-side? These are really important points, because what is the NHS for us? And what is the change that we may be trying to make to it? To what extent does this hold us back, what we might call status quo bias? We're also very keen to ask, well, there's one solution, which is paying more for the service. So we asked the question, would you be prepared to pay more taxes? Now, one of the ways this is done is that you could say to people, do you think people should pay more taxes for the NHS? And the challenge with that question is people might say yes, but they don't mean them. So we were very keen to do what we called a split sample. So we asked 500 people one question and 500 people another question. So half the sample said, I would be willing to pay more taxes in order to maintain the level of spending needed. And that was 66% against the increased taxes in order to maintain the level of spending. So people mean their own money. Now, when you show this to various people, there's a few reactions. One is, well, they don't mean that. They wouldn't actually do it. My personal view is probably that that's not actually true. That we are in a position, if you look at where the politics is in this country, and where we're concerned about public service, where we may well pay more. And again, in this room, you're not what we call a representative sample, but again, ask yourself the same question. I think that's a very interesting way of looking at some of these polling questions. So there's the local versus national, and I think this is very relevant to this audience. Thinking about the treatments and services that are available on the NHS, which of these statements most closely matches your opinion? Treatments and services should only be available on the NHS if they're available to everyone and not dependent on where you live. 67% of people hold that view. The availability of NHS treatments and services should be based on local need rather than a one-size-fits-all approach across the country. By any other name, this is a postcode lottery question. Now, what's very interesting is that this is where, and we've talked a lot about this today, what do different methods give you? This gives you a top-level instant reaction that someone would give to a polling question. So there was a piece of work done a few years ago, qualitative, working with people in local areas. And actually, people can have a very reasonable question about what's available. So if you do this exercise in Eastbourne versus Brighton, you will come up with different findings. And again, it's getting beyond, this is the challenge, it's starting to have that conversation in a local area. This is about decision making, and again, I think relevant to this audience. Who should be making decisions? And thinking of how decisions about treatments and services should be made, which of these statements most closely matches your opinion? So without going through them all, the top one is broadly that they're healthcare professionals, they're trained, they should make them, around 29%. The middle option is a betwixt and between. We want to be consulted, but ultimately healthcare professionals can make the decision, 56%, and then more actively involved is 14%. So what does this mean in terms of engagement? I think it means a few things. One is, we heard in Dorset earlier on, how do you get to the silent majority? How do you know who you're engaging with? Are the actively involved some way systematically different from the rest of your population? And again, that example came up for those of you who saw Dorset. How do you go about hearing from people? And also, if we're listening to the 14%, how do we get them to think about how they represent other patients? And this is a real challenge for things like Local Health Watch. Who are you representing? There's a real challenge for people in this room from patient groups to think about, how am I using other data, other information for me to represent a wider population in my work? One of the things that I get slightly frustrated by is things like the 5-year forward view. That's not the end of the sentence, but it is how we talk a lot about ageing populations, we talk about rising comorbidities, we talk about all the challenges we're facing, and they always have footnotes against them. They always have lots of references. And then we talk about rising patient expectations, and there's rarely ever any evidence beyond anecdotal evidence that starts to answer this question. Now, I'm not saying we've cracked this, but what we tried to do is start to ask the question. How realistic, if at all, would you say people's expectations are of the service they should get from the NHS? And again, 63% broadly saying realistic. Interestingly, that 30% are also the people more likely to say we shouldn't maintain it in its current form. And then you say, to what extent do you think they're met? And again, 73% say met or exceeded expectations. Now, I think we often talk about the consumer right now society. Certainly people at national levels will regularly talk about this. I'm not so sure. I think actually we give some leeway to the NHS that we don't give to other areas of our life. And I think we almost forgive it things that we wouldn't forgive in other areas of our life. I just want to read a quick story. So this is from a patient called Michael Wise, who's in a report that we produced. He wants to start with, overall, the care I've received from frontline staff, primarily from the NHS, has been outstanding. I therefore have some reservations about describing the adverse findings as reported below, because I do not want to detract from this overall excellence of care. However, I think it's important to point out some of the shortcomings and possible solutions based in my observations. He then goes on. I had a cannula inserted for the administration of intravenous IV antibiotics. I knew it was not positioned into a vein, but the nurse would not listen. I then had repeated IV infusions of antibiotic causing severe pain and swelling of my hand. It was only when I was seen later the next day by a consultant that the cannula was correctly placed. My trust in that nurse evaporated very rapidly. Patients do know when something's wrong, and they should be listened to. He then finishes it by reiterating his thanks for the hard work of the staff in the hospital. So one of the questions I have around expectations is actually, are our expectations too low, and do we not place enough emphasis on changing the system? Question for this audience. Finally, I just come to a couple of other thoughts, new ways of working and opportunities. I could not believe strongly enough in this agenda that you need to understand who you work for. By that I mean patients and users. There are so many times during my career with the frustration that simple things that could be changed based on user feedback are not listened to. Alf Almali said recently at a King's Fund event, any other industry not listening to your users would lead to bankruptcy. And also remember that people have very, very good ideas if you take the time to listen. We've had lots of discussions today where I feel this agenda can feel the appendix to the NHS. It's too easy to leave behind in straitened times. How do you make it the beating heart of the NHS? How do you communicate that voice back in to make sure that change is driven by people who are using the service? But I would also add there's a challenge for patient and user groups on this one, which is how do they interact with the service? And I will be frank on this one of various experiences where if you are shouting at someone repeatedly, that's often driven by frustration, and I understand that. But if you are shouting at someone repeatedly and they turn their back because they don't want to be shouted at anymore, that's also a reasonable reaction. So this is both sides, and maybe sides is even the wrong word. This is about the system. Now, as we move towards AC, and I'll try not to use three-letter acronyms, but as we move towards better system working, we are bringing local government back in now. We are bringing the public health community back into health. One of the key challenges right now is we know the problems on patient experience are between services, but we measure by service. We know what's happening in GPs, we know what inpatients, we know community services, and we know social care. We don't join it up. If you're responsible as a system, there is a significant opportunity. How do we link up with the patient experience team in an acute trust? How do we link up with the public health community within local government? How do we link up with PPGs? I think there's a real challenge for this audience. We talked about resource, and that's a question. There is significant amounts of resource out there already, or available things that we could be using. GP patient survey goes to 2.1 million people a year. It gets 800,000 responses. It is woefully underused. That's about how you make the case. That 1 in 5 people feel scared and alone in hospital. That's statistically valid. Doctors are probably more likely to listen to that. How do we use these combined? The last one is language. We are not good at using language with the public. So certainly we talk about ageing population, rising demand, increasing expectations, new technologies, integration, transforming at pace and scale is my least favoured one. Actually, if you listen to the public out there, it's waste, In a post-Brexit world, let's be truthful about this one, there's an immigration question, whether we like it or not. Postcode lottery, treating the wrong people. Again, that's about rationing of care and staff under pressure. Again, it's using the language early on. Final example I give was the cervical screening letter used to go out for many years. I think it's changed now. It says, you're due for cervical screening. A piece of research I did, first question was to a woman in Tower Hamlets, do you go for cervical screening? No. Do you go for a smear test? Yes. That's value. And the final thing I'll say is there's an economic case to be made here. We too often ignore the fact that there is an economic cost-benefit argument to be made for including patients. Readmission, for example. How do we understand what's happening at discharge? We know it's not good. And how do we link that into readmission? If your finance director or CEO is not interested in this agenda through their heart, how can you engage their mind and the account sheet? I'll finish there and hand over to the panel.